Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers, artists, entrepreneurs, musicians, sports figures, social activists, change makers, people who fulfilled their dreams, sometimes against great odds. This podcast is brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. My guest today is Loren Schoenberg, a tenor saxophonist and pianist who has played and recorded with Benny Carter, Benny Goodman, Eddie Durham, Marion McPartland, and many more jazz luminaries. He won 2 Grammy Awards for Best Album Notes in 1994 and 2004. Schoenberg was instrumental in the establishment of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, where he is today the museum's senior scholar. He is also an educator and author. He is on the faculty of the Juilliard School and has taught at the Manhattan School of Music and the New School. His published works include the book, The NPR Curious Listener's Guide to Jazz, which covers everything from the history of jazz to the language and many musicians who have contributed to the genre. Hello and welcome, Loren, to our podcast.
Thank you very much. I've heard a lot about it, with my involvement out in WVIA and environs. I've actually listened to quite a few. So, Lisa, I'm honored that you asked me to participate.
Oh, that's terrific. We're so happy to have you here. Now, your life has certainly been filled with music, specifically jazz, and from a very early age. You grew up in New Jersey, but it wasn't long before you made it across the bridges and through the tunnels to New York City to hear some amazing music. When other kids your age were listening to rock and roll, what drew you to jazz? How did you get there?
Well, it's a good question. It started with my father and mother, which would seem logical. Well, first of all, my father had 78 RPM records, and I guess, I'm born in 1958. So that's not that unusual. That's what they had been listening to, those old 78s. They weren't old at that time. And he had an album of music from Al Jolson. There was no pictures. It was just a pair of white gloves on the cover and Al Jolson. And I don't know what it was, but I was a strange kid. I loved those records. I loved the way he sang. I loved the enthusiasm and the verve. And I used to stand in front of the mirror and sing along with the record. So I think my parents realized pretty early that, they had some kind of strange child. Then we had a piano in the house. And my mother, when I was about 4 years old, started to show me some basic things on the piano. But I lived in a small town, a small street, and there was an elderly lady who gave piano lessons just a few houses down. And I started taking piano lessons. So I started to actually play music and read music at a relatively early age. Both my parents loved music, and my father specifically, who wouldn't have known an A flat from a B flat, had an innate sense of music. And I found out more about this as the years went by and as I started studying and went to college and all this kind of stuff. And I could just tell when I would listen to music with him that he sensed the important junctures of what was happening. And I could just tell, he would say something or point something out. I like to think that maybe I got that from him.
So your father was a jazz aficionado?
No. No jazz at all. Music, just music, classical music, not so much a rock and roll of the day, but just whatever you'd hear on the radio, or he liked folk music and stuff.
So how did you go from Al Jolson to, say, Benny Goodman or into New York to the jazz clubs?
In those days, they showed a lot of movies on television. And if there was an old movie on, I would watch it and I'd look for the Al Jolson movies and then had to confront blackface and all that. And then also the other great music that was in all those movies. And that led me to seeing Benny Goodman in a film called Hollywood Hotel. And then I would ask my parents to take me into New York City to see the old movies. I was just that kind of kid. And they did. My folks were so supportive in that way. That led me to jazz and Benny Goodman. Then my local public library in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, had a copy of the Benny Goodman Carnegie Hall concert LP set. And I started listening to that. And then I heard Lester Young play the saxophone and Teddy Wilson play the piano and all these great musicians. And I kind of just fell into it naturally. By the age of 13 or so, I was a diehard jazz nut.
I'm thinking of the old Hollywood movies. A lot of them were sort of big band movies, swing, that kind of movie that really kind of drew you to the city. But jazz has so many, there's blues, there's ragtime. It's not just big band. How did you learn to love all of that?
Well, it was really married to my burgeoning awareness of and understanding of African-American culture. And all the things you mentioned, whether it's blues or ragtime or swing or modern jazz or rock and roll or gospel or name it, rhythm and blues, it's all something that came from African-American roots. And I began to slowly dawn on me what the story was and what it was about that music that just attracted me. What was it? Some people say that music is essentially rhythm. If it wasn't rhythm, then we wouldn't have ba-ba-ba-bum. We would just have ba, there'd be no second note. So the rhythm of it is what really, I guess, as a kid, just something about that beat that got me. And then realizing, well, I kind of felt happy when I listened to it, but sometimes I felt sad when I listened to it, and began to realize that somehow this music kind of afforded me some kind of emotional response. And then I seemed to have some kind of natural talent. And all that conspired by the time I was in high school to start to think, well, maybe music is the way I'm going to go. I mean, there had been no musicians in my family, except my aunt who studied opera early on, but didn't pursue it.
But you ended up playing the saxophone.
Yes, that's true. Studied piano from 4 pretty much until I got into college. I went to Manhattan School of Music as a music theory major. But saxophone I picked up in my teen years because I was so nuts about the way that Lester Young played.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Charlie Parker, but
No.
okay.
And almost kind of taught myself to play the saxophone. And then by the time I really started having a professional career in those college days, it was more as a saxophonist than as a pianist.
You actually went on to form your own orchestra. That must have been quite a task. How did that come about?
Well, yeah. When I moved to New York in 1976, I was going to Manhattan School of Music, and in the evenings, I would hang out at a wonderful club around the corner on Broadway and about 112th Street called the West End. And at the West End, a lot of the old musicians who had been, of course, old, they're my age, what I am now, the people who had played with Count Basie and Duke Ellington, and all those people who were not really doing much in those days, sadly, they were playing. And I got to play with them and sit in and play that music. And then I started working with whatever big bands there were around New York, and the bands that were playing the kind of music that I really loved, the Ellington, Basie, Goodman, professionally speaking, were not that great. They weren't really playing the music how I thought it should be played. So eventually, out of frustration, I got some friends together and just said, hey, I'm going to start what they called a rehearsal band, just get some music. Now, at that time, I was working for Benny Goodman as his archivist. And so I had access to his music. And I asked him, I was 21. I said, Mr. Goodman, would you mind if I Xeroxed some of the arrangements? I could play them with my, sure, go ahead. So that's how the big band started, just as something to experience playing the music better than I thought it was being played in most of the bands I was in. And then gradually it turned into an actual band that worked and that made recordings and all that.
Just out of curiosity, did you finish college?
You know, it's funny. I'm a dropout. I left in my 4th year to work with Benny Goodman. Then I went back, about 6 or 7 years later, just to finish up that bachelor's degree, and left again to work with Benny Carter. And I eventually wound up teaching in the graduate school of the school I never graduated from. But you can't do that anymore. I was very lucky at that time. You could start teaching in a university based on life experience. And so I could. Now I'm not sure that that's possible anymore. I was very, very lucky that way.
Well, you certainly had a lot of passion. What was Benny Goodman like?
Benny Goodman was like your kooky uncle. I got to know him very well, and I also got to know Artie Shaw very well. And they were kind of 180 degrees separate in temperament and music too, but they really merged, in their mastery of an instrument. And that's why Artie Shaw stopped playing the clarinet when he was about 45. To maintain the level of excellence that these guys had, you really had to be almost like monomaniacal or whatever the word would be. And he just didn't have time for it anymore. So as Artie always said, he says, I gave up being one of the world's greatest clarinet players to become a mediocre novelist. But Benny kept that devotion to the clarinet. So a lot of people tell stories about him. He couldn't remember their name, or he was kind of insensitive or whatever. The truth is he was obsessed with that damn clarinet. And he just might not be listening. You might be telling the story about how your house was washed away in a flood the night before, and he'd be thinking about, how do I play C sharp? So, but I was just so lucky. I was so fortunate just to be around people like that. And the older I get, the more I just realize how fortunate I was.
He actually took over your orchestra. Is that correct?
In 1985, was Benny's 50th anniversary as a famous band leader. And he was approached by public television to put together a band and to do a TV show kind of honoring that. And they said, well, Benny, we got a band together of all the old guys, all your old alumni, and we're going to get together. He said he did not want to do that. Made 1 million records with these guys, and it just wasn't going to be fresh. And then I had given him one of my big band records in which we had played some of his music. And we were actually swimming, the only time I ever went swimming with Benny Goodman, at his house up in Stamford, Connecticut, one afternoon. And he came back out of the water. He says, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to do that TV show and I'm going to use your band." Well, I mean, I almost drowned, you know. Uh,
Oh, my.
and so we became the last Benny Goodman Orchestra. He took it over and it went from a very good band, which it was under my leadership, to a Benny Goodman band. Folks can see it on television. It's all over YouTube it's called Benny Goodman Let's Dance. And he passed away, about 10 months later. He went out with his boots on. He played right up until the end.
Did you continue to play in that band with him?
I played in the band with him in the first period on the television show. And then eventually I was replaced. And by being replaced, I joined a very high list of wonderful musicians who were eventually replaced by Benny Goodman. I don't know whether it was because, it had been my band and it was kind of hard I was a very young man at that time, to kind of wrap my head around the fact that I was sitting in someone else's band, even if it was Benny Goodman's band, because I had put this together. Or B, he just wanted a better saxophone player. So it's possible that it was both. Shortly after he passed, though, his family and estate made me the curator of his archives at Yale University. And so I've been very involved with his music up until this day.
We do have a clip of you and your jazz orchestra, and I'd like to listen to that right now. We're listening to Out of This World, recorded in the 1990s. You obviously were a musician, but you were also attracted to you became an educator. So you were attracted to the history of the genre. What drew you to learning about that?
When I was 14 years old in 1972, I became a volunteer at the New York Jazz Museum. Now, this is not the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, which came about 40 years later or so, or 30 years later. And there was a man who ran the place named Jack Bradley. Now, Jack had been very close. He was kind of like the personal photographer and amanuensis of Louis Armstrong. And Louis had just died the year before. And as a volunteer, people would start to come in to hang out with Jack, the musicians who played with Louis Armstrong and the people who played with Duke Ellington. And I was a kid and I was at the front desk. It was a small place and I got to know them. And so it was only kind of natural that, hi, I'm Billy Butterfield, or hi, oh, this is Clarence Armstrong. He's Louis's kind of nephew, that I would start to look up and find out about these people. And then I didn't have to look up too much in books because I could ask them. And the fact that I loved the music of a slightly earlier period, it wasn't like I was studying history. It's like I was just getting to know the people that I was lucky enough to be around. And then that led into reading and led into study. So the study of the history and the people was commensurate with my studying of the music, too.
What a rich experience. My goodness. I know it's said that a fellow named Buddy Bolden might have started jazz, but you yourself have said, as have many other people, that the real founder of jazz was Louis Armstrong. So let's just talk about Louis.
Well, one way to look at it would be, at the same time as Picasso, there were other painters. There was Duchamp. At the same time as Shakespeare, there was Christopher Marlowe. At the same time as D.W. Griffith, there were others, and Bach and all these folks. So I think what it is that there's usually a figure in the arts who, around them, everything comes together. And they kind of wrap up what was happening, add their own thing, and then they do it so brilliantly that it kind of sets the stage for everything else so people forget all the other people. So with Buddy Bolden, that's just built on rumors and hearsay and memories. Louis Armstrong came along at the same time as Charlie Chaplin, roughly. And through the medium of recordings, like Chaplin with movies, his influence just spread around the world because everybody saw movies and everybody had record players. Not everybody, but that was the medium for listening to music around the world. So yeah, without a doubt. I mean, this is one of these kind of hyperbolic statements, but I think I could defend it in musical court, would be that, if you're playing jazz, even to this day, you're pretty much speaking the language or at least a dialect of what Louis Armstrong did in some sense.
Wow. Well, I know Louis Armstrong was not only a great musician, he was a very iconic singer. His rendition of Hello, Dolly even bumped the Beatles off the charts. But he did a lot of improvisation, isn't that correct? Improvisation is kind of important in the jazz world.
You could say that. That's an understatement.
Okay. Does that mean that you never kind of hear the same jazz song twice when you're listening to it live?
Well, you know what? It's both understated and overstated about improvisation in jazz. It's really not a mystery. Jazz is, for the most part, what people think of as improvisation is really kind of theme and variations. So, in a much more limited way, a classical pianist, just for instance, will play something slower, play something faster, probably play the same notes every time, but even some of them will mess with the notes just a little bit here and there. Let's remember that Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms were famous as improvisers. Okay, they were very well known. And Franz Liszt, to be able to sit at the piano and just do what a jazz musician does. The rhythm was a little different, but just play a theme and then go off on it. And the truth be told, every time you cook your favorite meal, you improvise. A little more of this, a little less of that. And frankly, it's no more mysterious than that. It's just in jazz, the amount of change per performance is probably greater than many, many other idioms. Because it changes more than in most other forms of at least Western music that we're talking about. Oh, I don't know, Lisa. It's like having a conversation with you. I'm looking at you here. We're talking to each other over the internet, and I can tell that you're interested. I can tell by your facial expressions or that go on here, stop. As we telegraph to each other. Well, it's the same exact thing with a jazz musician in the audience. All we need is one good listener out there, and a jazz musician will feel as though they're in conversation with this person. And they actually influence each other. So not only is every jazz performance different, but it's really different because of the people that are listening. That's a way to think about it.
I had not even thought of it in that regard. That is the audience interaction. So let's just talk about Louis Armstrong for a minute. I mean, Louis Armstrong, may I say that he's a bit of a hero to you?
Oh, more than a hero. For me, he functions like a lot of religious figures function for other people. I mean, outside, I don't think he created the world or anything like that. But Louis Armstrong and his music, for me, serve like an emotional need or a spiritual need that I think a lot of people find in quote unquote religion.
What were some of his best pieces that inspire you the most?
Oh, pretty much anyone. Every record he made has at least a dollop of genius in it. His record of La Vie en Rose, which actually has very little improvisation in it. There are so many.
Well, of course, he was a great trumpeter, but he also sang. What did you make of that?
When I think of Louis Armstrong, I just think of one thing. I think of him and his music, and it came out of his trumpet and it came out of his voice. And they're the same to me. There's really no difference. And if you take Louis Armstrong out of the equation, well, then you wouldn't have Bing Crosby. And if you wouldn't have Bing Crosby, you wouldn't have Frank Sinatra. And if you take Louis out, you wouldn't have Billie Holiday, or you wouldn't have Ella Fitzgerald. And you wouldn't have, up until this day, the way that people phrase, the way that they sing. It's almost like the air that you breathe. Like you're probably not even thinking about the air that you breathe. And Louis Armstrong is kind of like that, first in American popular music, and then kind of around the world in a certain kind of way. That he showed, that you could reinvent things and swing things and scat sing. But I'll tell you something, I'm convinced that, back in caveman days, people were scat singing, beep, bop, dee, bop, they were doing that when the dinosaur walked by. It's nothing really, really new, but he put the stamp on it. And you see how you smile when we think about Louis Armstrong? He's an amazing figure.
I mean, I think It's a Wonderful World? That was his song, right? Which was even popular after his passing.
What a Wonderful World. What happened was that tune came out in the 60s, and it didn't do very much. It was okay. He made a record of it. Oh, when was it? Somewhere in the 80s. Robin Williams was in a movie called Good Morning Vietnam, which took place in the 60s. and they put that record in the movie. And that's when it went to the top of the Billboard charts. And again, Louis Armstrong not only knocked the Beatles off, but he posthumously came in and became a #1 record seller again.
Amazing. Do you think he was aware of his influence and popularity?
Yes.
You never met him, is that correct? I know you were young.
Well, no. Yes, but the frustrating thing is, as I mentioned, when I was 14, turning 14, I went to work at the Jazz Museum with Jack Bradley. Now, Louis died in July 71. And of course, I would have gotten to know him or be around him just in a year or two earlier because of Jack was so close with him. But alas, I never did. But I did know a lot of people who knew him. And as Jack Bradley used to call it, I was inoculated or inducted into the gospel of Louis Armstrong as a pretty young man.
Why did they call him Satchmo?
Oh, Satchmo is because he was blessed with perfect teeth and perfect embouchure for the trumpet, and he had a very wide mouth. And they used to call him Satchmo. The original nickname was Satchel Mouth because it was like a satchel, a bag. It was so big. And there was an English guy, an English writer, maybe it was Max Jones, when Louis went to England in 1932, he heard them calling him Satchel Mouth, and he said, "Oh, Satchmo." He didn't know what they were saying. It became Satchmo. And I should mention that there are a series of wonderful Armstrong biographies written by Ricky Riccardi, who's at the Louis Armstrong House Museum in Queens. And he has written 2 and is finishing up a 3rd, what are the definitive biographies of Louis Armstrong.
Now, Louis Armstrong was born in New Orleans, which of course is, I believe, where jazz began. But he traveled the world. How much of an influence did he have on people like Charlie Parker or Charlie Mingus or jazz musicians who also kind of forged their own music?
Well, that's a great question. It would be like if you were to talk about a certain kind of Western music with chords and notes, and you say, well, what about Bach's influence? Say, well, they're pretty much still living in Bach's world, even Arnold Schoenberg, who's no relation of mine, but what they call 12-tone music and modern avant-garde music, or maybe you think of it like this music, it's still Bach's world because they're either saying that's still valid or it's not valid. With Armstrong, he created the idiom. Of course, they're influenced by him.
There's also other types of jazz like bebop and fusion. And when I think of Louis Armstrong, I don't think bebop.
Tell you the truth, and in my book, The NPR Curious Listener's Guide to Jazz, which you mentioned before, I try and explode those terms. I don't use them unless I have to. Bebop to me, even though I'm teaching a course on it for Jazz Lincoln Center coming up in a couple of weeks, it's a meaningless word to me, and I'm not going to go into why. It's like you teach children very simplistic concepts so they can understand, like, these are the kind of animals that'll bite you and these ones aren't, or something like that. And then eventually, the older you get, you begin to realize, well, a cat is not the same as a polar bear or something like that. These terms are reductive. The reason that we still use them has to do with money and the marketplace and Coke versus Pepsi. And I like free jazz, but I don't like bebop. And it's all commercialism. It has nothing to do with the music. Of course, you're going to hear Louis Armstrong and all these things. And if we had more time, I would show you, Lisa, and your listeners, how similar Charlie Parker and John Coltrane and all that stuff is to Louis Armstrong. They have a lot more in common than they have different.
We might have to do a part 2. But in your book that you just mentioned again, The NPR Curious Listener's Guide to Jazz, Wynton Marsalis has a foreword, and he says, to like jazz, you have to be curious. What did he mean by that?
Lisa, that's a great point. I'll tell you, I think if there's one trait that most jazz folks, the musicians, the listeners, the fans, the serious listeners, the people listen to in the background, all share is some kind of curiosity. That's been my experience in my over 50 years in this world. And so if you're curious, if you're the kind of person who wants to know a little bit more about something, or who's willing to say, well, I think this, but maybe there's something else I should consider, or I like the feeling of not being secure in my beliefs. I want to test it. Jazz does all those things. At this point, I still sometimes listen to music that I feel I don't like, but that's respected by people that I respect. And at least I put my toe into it and say, okay, let me try and see what the heck they're doing here. And more times than not, I come out with some empathy. I still may not want to listen to it again, but I'm not dismissing it.
You find something you like.
Find something that resonates.
Something that responded to the curiosity in you.
Yeah, it's true. It is true.
So I think I wouldn't be surprised to learn that that curiosity led you to help start the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. How did that come about?
You know, the impetus for the National Jazz Museum in Harlem came from a man named Leonard Garment. Now, Len was counsel to the president at the end of the Nixon administration. He worked with Pat Moynihan, but in the 1940s, he was a bebop saxophone player, sitting alongside Alan Greenspan, who you might remember, chairman of the Federal Reserve. Late in life, Len thought, man, I love jazz so much. It's done so much for my life. There should be a National Jazz Museum. And he was based in Washington. At that time, I was conducting and playing in the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra, and I was in Washington a lot. And I got to know Len. And long story very short, Len found the initial funding to build the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. He asked me if I wanted to create it. I did, and we became a Smithsonian affiliate. I brought in Christian McBride and at that time, my student John Batiste to be the co-artistic directors, brought in Ken Burns and Wynton Marsalis, and we are now almost 25 years old. I've stepped back quite a bit. We have a wonderful executive director, and I'm kind of the senior scholar trying to raise money and do programming and stuff like that. But we're still alive, which is really good for a not-for-profit.
What happened to the Jazz Museum on 55th Street?
The New York Jazz Museum did not live a long life. When you try and start a not-for-profit museum, or even a restaurant, which is not not-for-profit, the great majority fail. The New York Jazz Museum was a great idea, but it wasn't the right time and it wasn't the right place. So it only lasted about 5 or 6 years, sadly.
The success of the museum now in Harlem, what do you attribute that to?
Any museum or any cultural enterprise will sink or swim based on its relationship to its immediate surroundings. So, when you come to the Jazz Museum in Harlem, which is 129th and Lenox Avenue, you are walking the same sidewalks that Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Paul Robeson, everybody else walked. So that the history is built into it. And our programming was really built around the wants and the needs of the people that came to us. And being a jazz institution, you were talking about improvisation before, we were able to kind of move quickly and respond to the people around us. And so I think that's why it's lasted so long.
What can you see there?
At the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, we have some iconic things, artifacts. We have a piano that Duke Ellington wrote a lot of his music on that came from his sister. We have clothes that came from Benny Carter and things like that. We have instruments that came from some of the greats. But people come to our place not so much for the artifacts. They come for the exhibits, which are wonderful. But actually, I think they mostly come for the proximity to jazz being talked about and being played. We are not a huge place. We're a relatively small place. So when you come to our events, like you are in the same room with this great music being played, and you can talk to the people and you can socialize in a way that you can't do in Carnegie Hall or at Lincoln Center or big venues. There, you're just like most concert places, a little cog in a wheel, and there's 1,000 of you. The Jazz Museum, there's maybe 70 or 80. And in fact, we have to close the door sometimes. You can't stop people from, I think the Latin term is schmoozing. You just can't stop people from socializing at our events. And I think that's why people come. Plus, we also do educational programs that reach, 20, 30,000 kids a year.
Where is jazz today in terms of music? I mean, what is the future of jazz? Do we have some young musicians now really evolving the art and the craft?
That's a hard question, Lisa, because like always when talking about jazz, you're talking about American history, you're talking about American culture, realize where we are. I mean, this is 2024. Jazz has not been a big part of popular commercial music for over 50 years, just hasn't been. And so the audience is much smaller than it used to be. But jazz is something that will always be there. That's a very important barometer of American culture. It's such fun and great music. There'll always be people who listen to it. And I know this from teaching at Juilliard. There will always be a flood of young musicians coming in who love the idiom and who want to play it, but they also want to play the other kinds of music that exist now. And ultimately, I think that's what jazz always was. Armstrong and Ellington did not write their music and perform their music for a small little niche of people who go to a small little place to like a kind of music that's kind of niche-ish, like frankly jazz is, if you want to be honest about it. They wanted everybody to love their music. And that's why I'm so proud and thrilled with the success of someone like John Batiste and others who are as great jazz musicians as have ever been, but who also want to do music that's loved by the masses. That's what Ellington wanted. That's what Armstrong wanted.
Well, thank you very much, Loren. This has been a fantastic interview. I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting you and talking about jazz, and I hope people visit the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for doing what I would call a wonderful interview. I enjoyed talking with you very much.
Well, thank you. This podcast has been brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. For more inspiring stories, visit HarmonyTALKpodcast.com. Talk to you next time.